right, welcome back to Another World. I'm thrilled to welcome Mr. Doug Van Dorn to the podcast. Doug is a dedicated Christian pastor, husband, father, and fifth generation Coloradan who's been leading the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado for over 2 decades. With a Master of Divinity from Denver Seminary, he's an accomplished author and editor of more than a dozen books blending Reformed theology with explorations of the Bible's supernatural elements like the Nephilim, divine councils, and ancient giants. So, Doug, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, Silas, found out you're a fellow Coloradan, so how could I say no, right?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Before we jump right in, it does seem a little uncanny, right? Strange for a Reformed Baptist pastor to talk about the Nephilim, divine councils, and ancient giants. There's not a strong track record of those two things mixing well together. If you can give us just a brief introduction on what influenced you to write a book on giants.
Sure. Well, here's the story of it. I was preaching through Exodus many years ago. It's probably about 2008, 2007, something like that. And I came across a journal article that really had nothing to do with my sermon, but I was fascinated by it. And it was this article on Deuteronomy 32:8 and a textual variant that was there. The textual variant says that God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. And the paper was arguing that it was actually the original was according to the sons of God. So those are pretty different. The older Septuagint, the Greek translation, and the Dead Sea Scrolls both say the sons of God, but the Hebrew text that we have received says the sons of Israel. So I read like this 40-page nerdy paper. And I was like, that's pretty cool. And then I said, well, I nothing to do with that in my life. So I just kind of tucked it away. And, I've loved to explore strange things my whole life. I don't know if you're old enough to remember, Leonard Nimoy did a show called In Search of,
All
and that
right.
was like the original kind of out there documentary show, like, they like Ancient Aliens is today. I loved that show when I was a little kid. And so anyway, preaching several weeks later in Exodus still, come across another thing that reminded me of that article. And I'm like, it couldn't possibly be the same guy. So I went and looked at the same guy. I had to look into who this guy is. And turns out that it was a scholar named Michael Heiser, who at the time, only people who knew about him were guys that listened to Coast AM.
Mhm.
Found out that he's this Old Testament scholar in Wisconsin, did his PhD in Semitic languages, and had recently taken a job at Logos Bible Software. So I took a deep dive on Heiser, and at the time he had he was giving out an early version of his Unseen Realm book, and that book has since become, you know, very much a bestseller, the best-selling book Logos has ever put out. And he's became a household name. I ended up becoming friends with him, and then he passed away about 3 years ago now. But in his early version of this book, he was talking about these Nephilim. Questions that I get asked every once in a while, what do you think about Genesis 6 as a pastor? Like, I don't really know. Well, he gave me some really good answers for that. And he gave me a whole bunch of other things to talk about and to think about that I had never thought about before in the way he was talking about the angel of the Lord. Why does God have Israel destroy all the people in the land of Canaan? What about the Logos in John's gospel? How does that relate to Jesus? So there was all these things that were circulating in my head, and I had nobody to talk about it with, especially in Reformed circles. Like the Genesis 6 thing is all about their interpretation. I'm sure we'll get into this, is the Sethite idea. So a very natural interpretation as opposed to a supernatural angel view. So nobody touches this with a 10-foot pole, and nobody was aware of Heiser. And so the only way that I could think about figuring out what he was talking about was to start writing. And so I was in a rush to get this out because it was right at 2012 when the end of the world was supposed to happen from the Mayan calendar. So I had written this whole book called Michael and the Dragon and why 2012 doesn't matter or something like that. And then when I got done with the book, I'm like, I pretty much just plagiarized Heiser. I can't do anything with this. And because it was just me, working it out in my head. But as I finish it, I'm like, I think there's a potential here for more exploration of the Nephilim because Mike only talked about it in, 3, 4 chapters maybe, and then he just kind of dropped it. And I thought, well, I think there's probably a whole biblical theology of giants that you could explore. And so that's what I did and ended up writing that in 2013. So the next year, I guess, I had put that out, and then we came out with the 10th edition, 10th anniversary edition of it a couple years ago.
Yeah, I'm going through it now. A lot to say there, and I know we'll touch on a lot of what you wrote in the book here on this podcast, and I know you covered the subject matter extensively on many other podcasts and shows, and I do really appreciate you going over the subject again with us as we're somewhat newbies to Dr. Heisler's Nephilim Giants interpretation. So, if it's possible, and I know this is a tall order, can you walk us through or give us a survey of the timeline of the divine council, like the Watchers? I know it kind of starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and how this ties into Genesis 6. Again, I know this is a loaded request, but
Sure.
let's give it a shot.
Does your audience know who the Watchers are? Should we talk about who they are
No,
first, or?
correct. Yes, let's start there.
Okay, so the idea is that there's these heavenly beings that are called various names in the Bible. Probably the three most common names are angels. Now that's something that came along later with the Greek translation. My opinion is that the Jews who were translating the Hebrew into Greek were trying to make this palatable for their generation, I guess, whereas it wouldn't have been a problem for earlier, just only Hebrew speaking people. But I guess the mixture of Greek mythology and whatever, you start saying gods and it has a different connotation. So they started translating the word gods, Elohim, in the Hebrew into angels. Now, sometimes they would just leave it as theos, which is the word for God, but other times it was angels. And I like that they did that for our sake because I run into the exact same problem in my circles. If you talk about gods, it's like, you could get yourself into big trouble. It's not Mormonism or anything like that. So angels helps people digest that a little bit better, I think. Another term for them is watchers. You'll see this in Daniel 4. This was the big term that they were using in the intertestamental literature between Malachi and really up in through the time of the New Testament is being written. There's all kinds of stories about these watchers, and that's the word that they were using to translate a phrase, "the sons of God." Now that's where that paper that I told you about a minute ago comes from. That's the variant. The textual variant is God gave the nations their inheritance according to the number of the sons of God. And so you have this all kinds of strange things happening with the text there that for some reason Israel pops in and God drops out. And it's like, why would that happen? Well,
Right.
it's because there's a supernatural component to these sons of God. If you go to, so you want to talk about the timeline really begins in Job 38:7, where you have a passage where God is coming to Job and he asks him out of the storm and the whirlwind, he goes, "Where were you when I made the foundations of the earth?" And he's talking about the very earliest parts of Genesis 1, like day one sort of thing. When the sons of God were shouting for joy and the morning stars were singing to God, praising him. So
Mm.
sons of God are there, but the problem is there's no humans that have been created yet. So they have to be heavenly beings. So whenever they're created, people can speculate young earth, old earth. I don't care what you think about that. They're there before humans are there. And they're watching God do this creation of the earth. So then you come to Genesis. I think you brought up Genesis 1:26. Well, let us make man in our image. This is an idea that people have argued and debated over who's the us. Why is it plural? If God is, just one, then why is he saying us? And so, probably the most common interpretation has been that the us is the Trinity. So, God is speaking to himself. I don't have a problem with that, but I don't have a problem with it for different reasons than other people. Okay. Um, if you go back to Genesis 1, 1, and 2, and 3, You actually have the Trinity right there, God, and then the Spirit is hovering, and then the Word speaks. And so that's classic Trinitarian New Testament language. So is the Trinity there? Sure. But you have something going on in other parts of the Old Testament that will tell you that there's actually something called a divine council that exists in the heavenly realms. Psalm 82:1 in the ESV is probably the best place I take people to see this, because it actually translates and uses the phrase the divine council. God takes his stand in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So there's a council of heavenly beings. We see this all over the place. I think it's 1 Kings 22. There's a prophet named Micaiah who sees a heavenly vision, and he sees God, and all these beings are around him, and they start arguing over the king of Israel and how evil it is. And God says, "Who will be a lying spirit in his mouth, in the mouth of all his prophets?" And so they have a fight, and then finally he says, one spirit says, "I'll do it," and God says, "Go ahead, you will succeed." So there's this deliberation in heaven with these heavenly beings. Daniel 7 is another great one to see this, because it talks about how Daniel has a night vision, and he sees a throne, and he sees a river of fire, and he sees one like an ancient of days who sits on the throne. And then he sees all these other thrones around, and myriads of beings are there. Well, why do you need all kinds of thrones? And then he says the books are opened. What do you need a bunch of books in heaven for with guys on thrones? It's because it's a divine council scene. It's a place where the angels, for lack of a better word, or kind of administer their rule over the cosmos. And God, for whatever reason, decided that that's how he wants to organize the heavenly realm. It makes sense to me, because he organizes the earthly realm like that. He puts governors, he puts government, he puts bureaucracy in place so that we will be able to have culture, right? So
Yeah.
that's what I think is happening with the us in Genesis 1:26, that God is making man in our image, which implies that these heavenly beings are somehow, they also share the image of God. And a lot of people get uncomfortable with that, because they think, well, humans are the only ones that have the image of God in them. Well, let's look at the context, because the image of God is defined immediately as having dominion over the earth. That's so let's make man in our image, and then let them have dominion over the birds of the earth, all this kind of stuff, right? Well, what's
Yeah.
dominion? Well, it's a function of ruling, authority. So if you go and you look at what these gods are called in other places, especially the New Testament, listen to all the authority language and the ruling language. They're called thrones. They're called principalities. They're called powers. They're called rulers. They're called princes. All these are just various, takes on the same idea. And so they share, and a lot of people have thought this since the beginning of the church, that they share the image of God somehow with us. Now they're not us; they're different than us. We're humans, and they're angels. But nevertheless, God gave us the right to rule down here. Now, one last thing before we go on, which is that it's not the angels that are making men; it's God Himself. He alone does it in the biblical text. And I say that because you go and read like your Babylonian literature, any kind of creation epic in the ancient Near East, they'll talk about how the gods created men. And the Bible's very clear that that's not what happened. What's happening is that God is talking to a group, and he's saying, "Hey, let's go do something." And then he's like, "I'll buy." You know, let's go have pizza. I'll buy the pizza. That's the way Heiser talked about it. So he's the one who's doing the creating of humans, but he's doing it in a way that we are going to be sharing this image with these other created beings.
Now, so the titles Divine Council, Sons of God, and the Watchers, they're all synonymous with each other, right? Or
Yeah,
is this
basically. Uh-huh. They're
okay?
what they're all doing is they're giving you different functions of what they are. So a son of God, if God's a king, what's a son of God? He's a prince. So it's a title. A watcher, what is a watcher? Well, it's somebody who sits back and overlooks and oversees something. Okay, so that's really what's happening with the various words. An angel is even the same way. An angel is just a messenger. So in this case, they're heavenly messengers.
Yeah. So in the book of Job, the timeline kind of somewhat starts there. They're rejoicing in heaven over creation. and then something takes a turn, right? There's rebellion, and I guess how does that intersect with Genesis 6? Because I know there's good sons of God, and then there's bad. Some have fallen and some have not. Am I correct?
I think so. Yeah. If watchers are, other names, seraphim, cherubim, those kinds of things, and we know that there are cherubim that are good that are guarding like the gate of Eden when God kicks Adam and Eve out, or there's seraphim in heaven in Isaiah 6, which is another divine council scene, and they're worshiping God. Then it makes sense that there are many that are not fallen. I tend to think that. Um, or at least they're loyal to God in some, something like that. I tend to think that the Michael and the dragon, where he says that a third of the stars were cast out of heaven, kind of gives you a picture of how many were disloyal and how many were loyal.
Did that rebellion take place before creation, or did it take place
It's a great question,
after
Silas.
creation?
Yeah. So mm, the way I describe this is that there's kind of like multiple rebellions. So you have the Genesis 3 rebellion. Very clear that there's a rebellion. There's a heavenly being. We call him the serpent. The New Testament calls him Satan. And he was at least fallen when he tried to tempt Eve to sin. The question becomes, when did he fall? Ancient Jews talked a lot about how he probably fell when God made Adam and said, let him have dominion over the earth, because he's kind of like, well, why would this ball of mud have dominion when I'm the most amazing creature that you've ever made? Why shouldn't you give me the earth? And so he was upset about it. They even tell tales about how uh, God paraded Adam and Eve in front of Satan and forced him to bow down and worship him. So what they're trying to do is wrestle with the very same question you are.
Yeah.
But, so you have a fall there. You also have, I think, a fall in the New Testament of Satan. Now, it's not a fall into sin, but it's a fall into rage to try and kill Jesus. And I tend to think that that's probably what the fall of Michael and the Michael and the dragon story in Revelation 12 is talking about. And I have a whole thing that I could do about how I think that took place at the Transfiguration. So, but for the focus of this episode, there's another fall that takes place with different heavenly beings. They're brothers, comrades. I don't know what they are with Satan, but this is the Genesis 6 story where these sons of God see these daughters of men and they see that they're attractive. And so they take them as wives. And when they take them as wives, then the wives give birth to these creatures called Nephilim. So again, we have a lot of debate in our modern day about what is taking place there. But I can tell you this with 100% certainty. I get this from a scholar named Yap Dodens, and there was another one, guy's last name I think was Newman, who have both. One, Newman did an article for like Journal of Evangelical Theological Society 30 years ago, and then Dodens did a PhD dissertation where he looked in the history of the interpretation of Genesis 6, and what he uncovered was that 100% of all known interpretations of Genesis 6 at the time of the New Testament took a supernatural view. There was no such thing as a natural view. So what that means is that there had to have been, when these sons of God saw, there had to have been another fall that took place. And so you go and you read the way that the Jews are either telling a story or they're remembering tradition. And I think they're actually remembering tradition. Um, that fall took place sometime in the days of Jared, one of the ancestors of Noah that's mentioned in that genealogy there in Genesis 5. And that's when they started this activity down here that you read about in just the 4 short verses in Genesis 6.
So a portion of the sons of God fell. Not all the sons of God fell,
Right. Yeah,
right?
if you read Enoch, for example, first Enoch, it expands on this for 36 chapters basically, and it gives a number. It says that there were 200 of them that came down and did this they came down on Mount Hermon, the highest mountain in Israel, in the very north part of the today's Golan Heights. That was the spot where they did this. And so it mentions that there was 200 of them. Interestingly, I'll tell you this. This is a fascinating thing my friend Derek Gilbert uncovered back in the late 1800s when they were doing all these archaeological surveys of Israel. The British were doing it. They sent a dude to the top of Mount Hermon to see what he would find. And he actually found the highest ancient temple of the entire world.
Oh, wow.
So it's at like 9,500 feet or something like that. And they found a giant stone inscription that was in Greek. So you don't know how old it is, but it has to have been really old. And it basically said something like, "This is the place where the watchers came down, the place of the curse." And it was, it's basically almost word for word what it says in First Enoch chapter 6.
Yeah. I've done a Google map and zoomed in at the very top, and there's like a UN building.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's whole probably reasons for that.
Yeah, I'm sure. So back to Genesis 6, roughly 200 fallen angels, the watchers, came to Mount Hermon, lusted after the daughters of men. And then they created a hybrid being, like a demigod, right? Called the Nephilim. And they perverted the world. Like they mixed their DNA with the DNA of humanity. I guess for me, it's kind of hard to digest that an angel mated with a human being. They clothe themselves with flesh, right? And
Right.
like there seems to be compatibility with our DNA with their DNA. Um, did they just stop there with humanity, or was there also mating with creatures as well?
Yeah, so I think it's the book of Jasher, which is not Jasher, I'm sorry, Jubilees, which is another one of the highly respected kind of Jewish books before the New Testament talks about how that they were mixing their seed with animals. And so this is where you get the idea of chimeras, mentors and centaurs and sirens and all that kind of stuff. That so at least the traditions are that that was what was happening. It wasn't just with humans. So that
Yeah.
leaves that would leave open then a possibility, two different possibilities of what happened in the Genesis 6 story. Were they actually mating with humans? Well, maybe. The reason I say that is because when you like if you go look at the Sodom and Gomorrah story, that starts in Genesis 18, not 19. 19 is the Sodom story proper, but the story begins in Genesis 18. And it says that three men came to Abraham and he recognizes them immediately. And one of these men, and the word for a man in the Hebrew there is the word ish. One of these men happens to be Yahweh himself, which is completely mind blowing. That's the whole angel of the Lord stuff that Heiser talks about for, a handful of chapters in his unseen realm as well. That the angel of the Lord there and these two other beings are called men, and they have physicality to them because Abraham washes their feet, and then he kills the calf and he makes a dinner for them and they all eat together. And then two of them go, in a miraculous way, like almost instantaneously, and they're in Sodom and Gomorrah. And then one of them stays there and having a face-to-face discussion with Abraham that Sarah overhears in her tent and starts laughing about. So it's very physical and embodied. And when you come to the story at Sodom, you see that these Ish men are also called angels. And so it's very clear that these are not human beings. So the reason why that's important to me with the question of Genesis 6 is because humans are also called Ish. So we share Ish, whatever that is, and it's always translated as a man, a human.
Hmm.
What we don't share is the Hebrew word Adam, which is also translated as a man. But angels are never called Adam, ever, not a single time, but they are called Ish. So to me, I don't know, is that like a wolf and a dog breeding together or something like that? We're really close in our genus, but not the same species, And
Yeah.
would that make it possible? I think that maybe. But so the second option would be, well, if they're doing stuff with animals, then that wouldn't work. So are they manipulating DNA? And I go into a little bit of speculation. I think I tell people it's speculative in the book that I'm like, but there's some interesting things about it seems like people knew about DNA back in the ancient world. And how could they possibly have known that without microscopes? Well, I don't know, but it seems like they did know it. And so it's possible that you have something like that happening.
Is that a possibility that that's how dragons came into play?
Yeah, I have no problem thinking that that's a possibility.
Wow. What about dinosaurs? You think that's how they came into?
Yeah, in my mind, those are kind of siblings. Um, yeah, so I actually think that dinosaurs did walk with men. Um, there's a there's a thought, this actually comes from more recent ideas about dinosaurs. I think they bring it into some of the Jurassic Park movies where dinosaurs are like hybrid creatures where they're both reptilian and avian, so the birds and they're lizards. Well, according to the Torah, that would be an unclean thing because uh, it's a mixture of kinds, which is the exact same thing that an Nephilim would be.
Yeah.
And so when you read what came on the ark, you find that it was all the clean animals. And so why wouldn't dinosaurs make it through, assuming, for sake of argument, that they were there? Well, because they were unclean. They might have also grown way too fast and they couldn't. I don't know.
um, so God was angry, and the flood happened, and the second rebellion, right? As Dr. Heisler puts it,
Right.
and everything died but Noah's family. Um, the Nephilim also, and the giants of that day, men of renown, right? They also perished. And my understanding is their spirits, obviously, they became disembodied spirits who, fast forward, are what Jesus considers as an unclean spirit that possesses people, right?
Yeah,
Is
this was a very common view in the early church and certainly among the Jews as well. That the idea is that metaphysically, because they have heavenly fathers and earthly mothers, like what is their inanimate part, their soul? Where does it belong? Is it earthly? Is it heavenly, like an angel? Well, no, it's somewhere in the middle, and so it would be something that's in the air, the middle space between heaven and earth. And so these are spirits that haunt the air, and they were once embodied, and then when they die, they're these wandering, demon spirits. Now, I'll say this also because there's a distinction to be made between a human dead, which we would call a ghost, and an unclean spirit, which would be a demon, properly speaking. So a demon would be a disembodied Nephilim, whereas a ghost would be a disembodied human. And when you get into that whole realm, what you find is that ghosts are they're almost like projections or something. They're like something is stuck and they don't really do anything. You just see some, you see in the Civil War ghost stories, they'll continually see a ghost just walk and do the same thing every night in the same place. It's
yeah,
not mischievous. It's not evil. Demon stories, though, are, obviously much different. That's where you get in like your Conjuring movies and stuff. So why would that be? It's because the demons they have a supernatural element that the humans, I mean, it's not that we're not supernatural because we have souls, but they're also malevolent creatures. And they were incredibly wicked. Um, so if you look at, I think I have a whole chapter on this in the book about the law. A lot of people don't think about this, but when God's giving the law to Israel, he constantly says, you are not to act like the nations around you. And what are the nations around you? Well, they're giants, or at least they're mixing with giants. And so what are they doing? Well, they're doing all kinds of uh, sexual perversion. They're doing all kinds of violence. They're doing all kinds of things like crossing over to the other side, divination, and then just basic ethics of not caring about the poor and caring about those in need in society. All of those are wrapped up together in what the people of the land around, in Canaan that God told Joshua to destroy. That's what they were doing. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from this root of these Nephilim entities and the way that they were living when they were embodied in flesh.
yeah. And it's still fascinating. Just a
Oh
lot of
yeah,
this for me is just data points, but peripheral theology, but not theological framework. So I'm thankful that you're elaborating on this. In the Old Testament, there the only thing I can think of is when was it Saul was oppressed by a demon or a
Yeah,
spirit, right?
most probably. I would say probably. It's called an evil spirit. So it's not technically called an unclean spirit, and probably that's language that came later that was developed. But yeah, probably.
Was possession frequent in the Old Testament, or is that
Not that we know of, and not from the biblical account itself. We don't really get anything about possession until you get to the New Testament, where it starts talking about that explicitly. So, in order to answer that question, I think you need to go to um, the nations around Israel to see what they were doing, and you start finding out very quickly that every nation has these exorcists, itinerant exorcists that are going around casting out demons out of everything. You find it in Babylon, you find it in the Canaanites, you find it, you find it even in the book of Acts, where you've got these itinerant Jewish priests that are going around casting out demons. Well, that couldn't have just started right there. That had to have been a school that had come from somewhere in the past. So,
yeah,
um, yeah,
yeah,
was it happening in Old Testament days? Sure. Does the Old Testament really care to talk about it? Not really.
yeah, that makes sense. So Genesis 6, flood happened, and then in Genesis 6:4, it says that giants were there before and after the flood.
Right.
Um, so did the fallen or the sons of God, the fallen angels, they procreated again through humanity? Is that kinda how things
Yeah,
played out?
but not the same entities. So those entities were locked away, and they're not let out until the end of days.
Can
Peter
you
tells you
elaborate?
that.
Yeah,
So he talks about Second Peter 2:4 talks about how that they were locked away in Tartarus, the deepest part of hell, and they won't be let out. And other books like Enoch also elaborate on that. But so you have to account for how did this happen again? If there's Nephilim after the flood, which there are lots of them, um, how did that happen? So you've got like four logical options as far as I can tell. One is that one or more of them survived the flood. So maybe they were in caves or something, and so they never died. That's possible. The Jews tell a story of how Og, the giant of the days of Moses, actually survived by hitching a ride on Noah's Ark, and Noah fed him through a hole. Like
yeah,
those are children's tales, and I tend to think that that didn't happen, because what would be the point of the flood if a bunch of them weren't killed anyway? Because
yeah,
that was the point of the flood, is to kill everything, right? So,
yeah,
that to me, that one's kind of out. Another one is that, well, it's kind of related to that the flood wasn't actually universal, and so some of them weren't even hit by the flood. Same thing to me, like that does just kind of defeats the point of the story. Another option is that maybe one of the people on the ark carried the genetic material. So it wouldn't have been Noah's family, his sons. It would have been one of their wives.
right,
Some people think that that's a possibility, and I don't rule it out. But to me, that also kind of defeats the point of why these eight. If the whole point was to make sure that the human line was genetically pure,
yeah,
that would defeat the point as well. So that kind of leaves you with one logical option left, which is that another group of angels came down, did the same thing. And that's the view that I take. That's also, like, if you look at your Greek mythology and just use it as a comparative, not saying that it's all accurate or whatever, but that they are telling a similar story. That's exactly what you find. So you find a primordial pre-flood kind of guys called the Titans, and they were doing all kinds of wickedness. And then you find that the Olympians who overthrew them do the same thing
yeah,
afterwards. And so Zeus gives birth to hundreds and hundreds of demigods with all these women that he's in love with.
yeah. And what about today? Nephilim still exist today? You think they're out there?
That's $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
There's stories that there are,
What are
and
your thoughts?
I think it's possible. I don't have any theological reason why I should deny it, because if there were giants in the days of Joshua, giants in the days of David that were still physically on earth,
Yeah,
it's not a theological problem that I would have. All it would mean is that they were kicked out of where they were at, and then they migrated to other places. And so is it possible that some of them weren't killed by the the people in the places that they migrated to, that maybe they went underground, maybe, they're hiding. Sure. Why not?
I know you hear, I mean, the famous one, right? The Yeti, Sasquatch. Um, that's a possibility. Maybe here in the mountains of the Rocky Mountain. I mean, that might.
Lots of Sasquatch stories up in the hills up here, right?
What are your thoughts? I mean, with all that going back, just to have a question regarding possession. What are your thoughts about possession today? I just hearing other episodes and podcasts, it seems like to be
Yeah.
more of an acceleration of this happening at the local church. Exorcists from the Catholic Church are stating there's a noticeable increase of possession. I mean, what are your thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, isn't it? I guess I have multiple ways of thinking about it. One is that I think we're leaving the days of modernism and we're moving into postmodernism and even postmodernism, whatever that's going to look like, transhumanism or whatever.
Yeah.
And just as a way of thinking, is it necessarily true that we have more possession than we did before, or is it just that we have a worldview that's more accommodating to accept and believe it?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas, say, 100 years ago, we just we just chalked everything off to some sort of a psychiatric disorder, and then we threw them in a mental hospital.
Yeah.
So that's one thought. I do absolutely believe in demon possession today. I think that that's a truth. It's an inevitable truth. How can you? I don't know how anybody or why anybody would want to deny that. A question about, can Christians be possessed? That's a different question. And I know that a lot of conservatives, and this is the way I grew up, would say, no, it's not possible. And then they'll give their theological reason is usually that, look, we're the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that means we're clean. And so if something unclean came in, then how could that happen? The God can't dwell with evil like that. And I think, well, all right, maybe, but let's think about something else. Let's use an example of Job chapter 1 and 2, where you have Satan coming into heaven, into the very temple of God, to have a discussion with him about Job. Is that not a kind of a theological equivalent? I also wonder about why is it. Now, I'm a Baptist, so I'm not a Paedo Baptist. I don't believe that people are. I don't believe baptism. Not all Paedo Baptists believe this, but I don't believe baptism saves you. If it did, then this wouldn't be a problem. But since I'm a Baptist and I believe I'm saved, people are saved by faith in Christ alone, and then they're baptized, rightly speaking. And I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that the earliest Christians believe that too. Why is it that you have the church fathers performing exorcisms on adult converts before they're baptized if they can't be possessed by an entity?
Yeah.
In fact, they even have this as part of their liturgy, their baptismal liturgies. So, I think that this question is not as black and white as I grew up thinking that it was, but I also am leery of seeing every single thing. Like, this is the opposite reaction to a purely psychological projection thing. The opposite reaction is that everything that you see taking place in the life of a person has to be a demon. I don't believe that. I believe humans are perfectly sinful of their own accord. Like, that's the pronouncement that God gives both before and after the flood. Like, every thought of the heart of humans is only evil all the time. We don't really need any help to get bad.
Yeah.
But, true demon possession is more than just evil. It's like it's more than just sin. There's something that's wrong, something that's off. That, when you read the Gospels, you're like, yeah, super strength is an example. Like, that actually happens. How does that happen?
Yeah.
Just a rush of adrenaline, or is there something more happening? And, obviously you could talk about this for forever, but
Yeah.
those are kind of my thoughts about it. I don't know. What do you think? I'm curious.
Yeah, I do believe that there's an acceleration of it. However, I do agree that it could also just be that we're more aware of it today than before. I know Eastern civilization not only believes in it, it's pretty much baked into their cultural beliefs, and they also engage in it. Whereas Western civilization makes fun of it and makes money off of it through music and movies. However, there is a noticeable shift in Western culture Now, I believe I read a stat in 2024 that around 85% of Americans believe in demons and angels, spirituality. And I've witnessed it firsthand where I live. And I think it's scary to pretend that it doesn't exist or always try to explain it away, to try to say that it's some kind of mental deterrence or illness or induced by medicine, or it's just the pizza you ate last night, and to not give any attention to the strong possibility that what's happening is not from this world, that it's demonic is extremely bizarre. I mean, even secular psychologists have been known to give referrals to exorcists due to things happening to the person that are beyond natural.
So businesses actually are doing this?
Yeah, there are psychiatrists in their practice that do this. There was a famous psychiatrist, I believe his name was Dr. Scott Peck, who passed away, but wrote about his encounters with possession and how he would receive referrals from the Catholic Church to help them decipher or determine what was mental versus spiritual. And I believe he was a non-believer at first, but eventually became a Christian because of these encounters. Another psychiatrist who is presently known for this is Dr. Richard Gallagher. He currently helps exorcists determine if the client is possessed or just has a mental issue. He's encountered possessed people and has been on several podcasts to elaborate on this. I think he even wrote a book about his sessions with people who manifest preternatural activity. And he also lists, I think, 4 to 5 signs that show evidence to possession. Levitation, uh, you know, um, secret knowledge, I think, is another one.
Yeah. Speaking
Um,
languages that you've never heard before.
yeah, and even with that, just and maybe we can go into that a little bit. M- One of my thoughts about this is, with the pyramids and knowing that what people have experienced through possession, there's levitation where, this demon possesses a person and they levitate and then objects levitate. Do you think that was a possibility too with the pyramids, that maybe these fallen angels, through their minions possessed these people to levitate megalithic rocks to build these, the ziggurats, these giant humanly impossible
Yeah.
structure, right? No
Yeah.
technology we have even today exists to duplicate what they did back then. Um, yeah, I know we're going all over the place, but
No,
yeah,
these
what
are
do you,
fun. These are fun things to talk about. Um,
I thought, man,
so
that's a possibility.
yeah, definitely. I don't know that it has to be like just demon possession, and then the demon is. I don't know if I've ever thought about that before. That somehow the demons are possessing people and then causing those things to happen. I've more thought of it as just that the ancient world had developed um, a line of technology that was just different than ours. So we went down one route of a tree, a branch, and they went down a completely different route of a tree branch. And so they might have possessed things that we've never even conceived of, because that's just not the way that our scientific method has taken the initial first things that we have and gone with them in the ways that we have. Um, but there's all kinds of possibilities for how those things were made. I do think we have some really good evidence that they had a lot more high tech equipment that could, for example, cut stone at 90-degree angles perfectly. Now we have the evidence of it. It's just the only reason we don't believe it is because we say that's not possible. They couldn't have done that because we're the only people that could have ever done that. We've never found a saw blade. Like, why would you find a saw blade made of steel or something if 10,000 years after it happened? It's not. It's going to be gone.
Yeah.
So there's lots of things about the angel. I often tell people when I die, first thing I want to do is when I see Jesus, I want to say, "Thank you for saving me. Can you please give me a history lesson on what happened before the flood?"
There'll be a lot of us in that room. What are your thoughts about UAPs, UFOs? You think this has a link between the Nephilim and UAPs, UFOs?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about this. I just watched the first half of that new documentary that came out. I forget what it's called, but the guy interviews like 32, 34 different,
Age of Disclosure.
yeah, Age of Disclosure, including Marco Rubio, a whole bunch of guys. And I have mixed thoughts about that particular documentary because there's some folks in there that I think are deeply suspicious. CIA agents like John Brennan and stuff like that. I do not trust a word that he says. But there's other people in there, and I'm like, I think I do trust you.
Yeah.
So I believe that the UFO UAP thing is a real phenomenon. I I know that most Christians, and they even address this in the show. I don't know if you've seen it, but they talk about how uh, trying to get to the bottom of this has been very, very difficult in the higher echelons of like the Pentagon because there's a bunch of they say quote religious fanatics that have their dogma of what's happening, and they just say it's purely demonic. There's nothing else to it. And that's a lot of Christians do that. They kind of default to the demonic. And so that gets to your question, is there a Nephilim component to it? And I think yeah, there is. Um, especially when you're dealing probably with like orbs, lights, those kinds of things that we can't really prove that they're substantial. They're just ephemeral. They're just, they're moving around like you just see it, but that's it. But there's a whole physical component to this phenomenon that, if you believe these guys, we have got ships, we've got creatures. And it's not just us, it's the Russians, it's the Chinese. And you got your whole government, a whole bunch of people from your government that are telling you this independently. It makes me say at least, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So to me, the way that I would answer that part of it, I guess I don't theologically have a problem that there could be even other entities that are out in this universe that I don't know about. I mean, the Bible talks about the host of heaven, myriads and myriads and myriads. Are they all just one species? Could there be all kinds of species? Like I don't have a problem with that. A lot of people will immediately knee jerk to that, and they'll do something I think is so bizarre. They'll go, well, but then that means that, what about Jesus and what about sin in other parts of the world? And did Jesus die for them? And it's like, why are you even asking questions like this? Jesus is a human. He died for human beings, and that's it. If let's say that all these entities did sin, God's under no obligation to do anything for them.
Yeah.
So that whole piece of it that I don't understand why people go there when you bring up this issue, to me, it's really a non-issue. And so could there be other entities? Yeah. But we also know that, like I said earlier, you have angels that actually have physicality. And it's like, why couldn't there be a physical angelic component and not just a demonic Nephilim component to the phenomenon? We don't know what angels are. We don't know how they exist. We don't know about their bodies. We don't know how they interact with the world. We don't know if, they're the angels. Some of the creatures are described as having wings, like right, like 6 wings on the seraphim and stuff like that. They cover their face, they cover their feet. Is that purely iconographic? Are they really like that? What about the guys who came to Abraham? Did they have wings? No, they didn't have wings. They look like men. How'd they get there? Do they have the ability to just poof in and out of existence and go to other places instantly? Do they need craft? Like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that because I've never met one. And I would like to, but kind of I wouldn't like to at the same time.
Yeah. I know, Congresswoman Anna Luna was interviewed by
Right.
Joe Rogan, and I
She was
mean,
also on that on this documentary.
okay, yeah, I need to watch that. But yeah, she commented right away that have you not read the Book of Enoch? And what she knows connects with what she read in the Book of Enoch about the Watchers and their interaction with humanity. And that's even fascinating in and of itself too, because with these fallen angels, it seems like there's always a sacrifice. Like, I'll give you forbidden knowledge, I'll give you technology, I'll give you information, but you got to do something for us. So
Right.
there's this ritual, the ceremonial ritual that usually includes vile acts, right? The
Mm-hmm.
shedding of innocent blood,
Mm-hmm.
particularly children, and then they get, you know, they're empowered with this information, and then they create whatever it is that they want to create based on this information. It's just so, like a sci-fi horror movie. Um,
That
that just
moment when you realize that all the sci-fi you ever watched is actually real,
yeah,
that's
right.
kinda freaky.
It is, and you get into the rabbit trails with Aleister Crowley, and then Jack
Mhm.
Parsons, the father of NASA, with rocket propulsion. I mean, he there was it's documented. There was ceremonial rituals performed, and then they got secret knowledge. And
Yeah, what you're bringing up here to me is really interesting because it's one of the reasons why I think this is such an important topic, just the giants or the divine council.
yeah,
Because what it allows you to do is look at the world that we're seeing unfold before our eyes, which is completely insane. Whether it's UFOs, whether it's worldwide plans to kill human beings on an epidemic level. You know what I'm talking about?
mhm,
You know,
yeah, right,
transhumanism trying to turn us into something that's beyond human. Like there's so many of these weird things that Christians are not addressing that unbelievers and frankly, a lot of Christians want answers to. And we don't have a worldview that can even begin to remotely think about them. And so we just throw them into a corner and pretend they don't exist. That's not how you reach a culture. You've got to find out what's happening in the culture, and you got to be able to give them good biblical ways of thinking about things. And that's why where she goes to Joe and she's like, "Have you not read the book of Enoch?" What she's trying to do is say, "Look, there is a worldview that's able to accommodate what you're seeing, at least to some degree." And I think that the Watcher paradigm and the Nephilim paradigm, that whole storyline is massively important to what we're talking about. And I've just found it so helpful in my own life thinking about the weirdness, especially the last 5 years, but really since 2001 in my mind. But
yeah. And it's just kind of surveyed. And how I looked at it when after reading The Unseen Realm by Dr. Michael Heiser, Genesis 6, I just read quickly through it. I'm like, "Ah, okay, there's
right.
giants." They were just taller than the average Joe. And then there was evil, and then God, you know, pushed the reset button and then moved on. But it is peppered throughout the Old Testament. Once your eyes are open to all of this, like the Old Testament is alive. Like they were slaying giants. Like they were,
Yeah, like
not
literally physically doing that. And
yeah.
it tells you that's what they're doing. It's like, well, why is it that the only giant we ever hear about is Goliath? And then we don't even really read that as a real story. We're like, well, now go slay the giants in your life. Like, when you say that, you're really demeaning the fact that this was actually a 10-foot tall dude who was taunting the people of Israel. And David
Yeah,
goes out and actually kills him. And why? Because there's a whole storyline here of a promise that goes all the way back to Eden with the seed, that there will be two seeds and there will be a war. And at the end of the day, after one tries to kill the other, the one who is the seed of the woman will win this war. And that storyline is told in a very unique, interesting way through the Nephilim of the Old Testament that are given other names: Amorites, Rephaim, Zamzumim, all kinds of guys. But this is ultimately what Jesus comes to defeat. And when you think about the fact what we talked about with the demons, that these are disembodied giants, that actually means that war that David was fighting, that Joshua was fighting with actual giants, that Abraham was fighting with actual giants, that Moses was fighting with actual giants, that war continues into the New Testament, because every time Jesus is casting out a demon, he is dealing a blow to the serpent, and his offspring,
yeah.
if you want to think of it like that. And then he ends up legally destroying them at the cross and their power. And one day, second coming, he will totally destroy them in every way.
What are your thoughts? What's your position with the end times? You
Um,
dispensationalist? Are you pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib? I mean, there's a camp for everything, right?
yeah, I grew up dispensational. I moved out of it. I'm an old guy, so I graduated college in 1988. And there was a book that came out that year. No, sorry, I was a freshman in college in 1988. I'm not that old. 4 years younger, right? I get to save every year I can. Um, there's a book came out that year that said 88 reasons why Jesus will return in 1988. And he gave the weekend Jesus would come back. And half of us were just terrified. We're like, we're not going to make it through this weekend. See you later. And then it came and went. And the dude the next year writes another book, 89 reasons why he'll come back in 89.
Yeah.
And I right about then, I had grown up in those circles and I'm kind of like, I don't know about that. And then a guy comes out with a book in 1994 and another one in 1996 and another one in 2000, another one in 2001, another one in 2012. And at some point in time, I just said, I'm done with this. And so I actually ended up into a totally different camp, the amillennial camp. But I've kind of circled back in a really strange way that amillennialists don't usually do to say that I actually think we could very well be living in the very end of days. So as an amillennialist, I don't take the end times or put it this way, the last days to be something that's still in my future, because Peter in his very first sermon says the last days are here. And Hebrews starts off and says, in these last days, God spoke to us by his son. So I take the last days to be something that starts really at Pentecost and goes until the second coming. But with all the weird studies that I've done, Silas, I came across this. This comes through the work of a guy named I first heard about it through a guy named David Flynn, who probably was a dispensationalist, but I don't know. But super fascinating guy. You can see his stuff on YouTube. He did a couple of but presentations down in Roswell, actually with Heiser back in the early 2000s. And one of his presentations was on 2012. And he starts talking about this thing called the Great Year. And the Great Year is, a solar year is how long it takes the Earth to go around the sun. A great year is how long it takes the Earth to go around its wobble on its axis. So the Earth is not a top that's totally vertical. It's tilted. And that tilt is like 22 degrees right now. It varies over time. But that tilt is what gives us our seasons. That tilt, right? So if you look at that, if you look at it like an axis of a top that's getting ready to it's slowing down and it kind of starts wobbling, how long it takes for that vertical axis to go from one point all the way around a circle to get back to that point. And that takes 26,000 years. The ancient people knew about this. And they talked about this actually as an age, which is the same language that the New Testament uses, the end of the age. And they could actually break that down into 12 smaller ages that they called. And those ages are basically, you heard the song, The Age of Aquarius? There's that dawning of the age of Aquarius, the old 60s song. Well, people associate that with New Age, but it's actually something that's associated with astronomy, not necessarily astrology. We are entering into the age of Aquarius, and that just simply has to do with where the sun rises on the equinox every summer solstice. Every year that rising of on the very same day at the same time, every year that changes very, very slightly. So it takes 72 years for that to move 1 degree around a 360-degree circle.
Wow.
Well, what that means is that the constellations change over the course of time in where the sun comes up. So we're moving between the age of Pisces and into the age of Aquarius. The wild thing about all this is that we're at the very end of the age of Pisces. So you can think of it as like a month of the great year. We're also at the very end of the calendar year of the great year, because Aquarius starts January of the next great year, if you want to call it that. So we're actually like, there's nothing new agey about this. We are simply living in, I call it like December 31st, somewhere between noon and midnight. We just don't know.
Oh, wow.
So what does that mean? Well, if Jesus is going to come at the end of the age, I might have just found a way to get kind of the same place dispensationalists are, but in a totally different way, and without having to have all these timelines and stuff that I grew up with, and date setting, and the kind of stuff that I just grew so leery of.
Yeah. And, with all of that you just said, church is unfamiliar with all of that. But you know who's not? Occults.
Yeah, exactly.
They're
Those are the people who
familiar.
retain the knowledge of it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And, I mean, they seem very in tune with the timing, the symbolism, going from the zodiacs, astrology, like, they're very and they're just not just consumers of it, but they're followers of that stuff as well.
Yeah.
It seems like that plays a role, in all of this. Um, I know, my brother, he did the AI questionnaire and went down those rabbit trails. And in the end, in essence, it just said, kind of echoing what you said, was the great year, or is it the great age, right? Um,
So they call it it's called a great year, or they call it a Platonic year, and then they divide that into 12 according to the 12 constellations of the zodiac, which is how you measure time. And they call those are technically called the age.
and usually something big happens, right? When that comes to
Yeah.
sh-
Well, at the end of every this is the work of Graham Hancock's friend Randall Carlson. He's got a whole video on this that's just super interesting. Randall's definitely not a Christian. He actually his kind of website is a Gnostic thing. But what he does is he brings out it's a lot like David Flynn, who was a Christian, and he's giving you actually information that he probably shouldn't be giving you, because this is stuff that belongs in in the secret societies, because
yeah,
this is how they run the world, right? But he's telling you it anyway. And yeah, so he talks about this whole idea of the age, and people can go see that on YouTube if they want to.
yeah, awesome. Well, Doug, I know you're pinched for time, but thank you so much for um, fascinating discussion. I enjoyed every minute of it. How can people get in touch with you? You have a website?
Yeah, Doug, I think let me see what it is. It used to be DougVanDorn.com. Now it's DouglasVanDorn.com because I lost it. I forgot to pay the bill. So DouglasVanDorn.com. You find my stuff there. Our RBCNC.com also. That's our church's website, the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado. So it's just the initials. And I give that out just so people know about our church, but also because all of my sermons for 20 plus years are up there. And people go, and many of them are in PDF, so you can read them as well as listen to them. And if there's something weird in the Bible, I've probably talked about it if I've preached on it. And I preached on a lot of things in 20 years. And then, all my books and stuff are found at Amazon. Uh, I've written on some very normal subjects like the five solas of the Reformation or baptism. And I've written on some weird topics like conspiracy theories and giants. So you can go look at all that stuff over on Amazon.
Yeah.
They also
As
have
we
one other thing. If people are interested in this, we have a platform for anybody who is interested in both the weird stuff and Reformed theology, or just wanting to know more about it. It's a paid subscription site, but we do that to keep it behind a paywall so that we can keep the trolls and stuff like that out. And that's reformedfringe.com. And it's a fun place to come, and lots of people like to come and talk about pretty much everything that we talked about in the show today. So.
Awesome. Doug, thank you again. Go ahead and stay on, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Silas.